welcome to the latest edition of Planted Unearthed. My name's Sam Peters and I'm one of the co-founders of Planted, the first contemporary design show aimed at reconnecting people and spaces with nature. Following the success of the first series of Planted Unearthed, we're continuing to explore how design, sustainability, architecture, food production and nature can combine to create cleaner, greener, healthier spaces. In Series 2, we're looking deeper into the issues surrounding access to nature and how to create spaces where caring for the environment, consuming responsibly and living sustainably all come naturally. Today we're talking to one of the founders of an innovative and restorative farming group called Farm Wilder, a Bristol-based organisation which aims to encourage sustainable farming practices which work in harmony with nature. With large parts of Britain's countryside devastated by intensive farming, Farm Wilder promotes practices which restore balance to our natural ecosystems. And I'm delighted to welcome Farm Wilder's founder, Tim Martin, onto Planted Unearthed today. Tim, welcome to Planted Unearthed.
Hi Sam, great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on, Tim. We're big fans of Farm Wilder and indeed the sort of concept of sustainable food production. And I mean, why don't we start off, Tim, by you just telling us a little bit about Farm Wilder's story, where you began and what you're trying to do.
I guess it's a very long process. I've been fascinated by British wildlife for years. I mean, by all wildlife, in fact. And most of my career, I've been a wildlife photographer and wildlife filmmaker. Spent over 20 years in the BBC making wildlife films. But over the years, I just became increasingly aware of how much wildlife we were losing in the UK. So here I was spending my career going around the world filming wildlife, and yet every year British wildlife was declining, and it just became very depressing. I mean, there's another study would come out saying sparrows have dropped by this much, butterflies have gone down by that much, wildflower meadows declined by 97%, hedgehogs by 95%. I mean, it just became very, very bleak. And I just increasingly felt there must be ways we can do things about this. And I guess I'd always been interested in farming and in food. I've made a few series about farming. I made a series called Harvest with Greg Wallace and Philippa Forrester. I made some natural world programs about sustainable farming. And I just became fascinated because our food is our biggest connection to nature. And as consumers, we might think, yeah, we put out food for the birds, that's a good thing, garden in a wildlife friendly way. But by far our biggest impact is the food we buy. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized is that effectively by buying ordinary food in supermarkets, which is not organic and it's just ordinary sort of bog standard food from intensive agriculture, we're all complicit in destroying our nature and driving climate change. And it just struck me as horrifying that as somebody who cared about wildlife, there was nothing I could actually do about it. There's nothing I could do about farm wildlife. And farm wildlife is so important in the UK because 70% of the UK is covered in farmland. The way we farm has the biggest impact by far on our environment, on our wildlife, on climate change, pollution, on our rivers, everything. And yet, as a shopper going into a supermarket and buying some products, there's nothing you can do to select out stuff which is good for wildlife versus the stuff which is trashing wildlife. So the idea behind Farm Wilder really was to address that and to try and separate out food which was actually good for wildlife and good for the environment from stuff that wasn't.
In terms of the consumer relationship with food, and I guess consumer is a word that lots of people have a problem with fundamentally, but I mean, just the person going into the shop, into the supermarket, maybe in the city or indeed in the countryside, I mean, how important is it to get that message across, Tim, that the choices you make in the supermarket have a direct impact on what goes on in our green spaces and the biodiversity loss which you've described there as well?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's all driven by price. And if you go into a supermarket, as we're encouraged to, and look out the best offers, always go for the cheapest products, that is putting a huge squeeze on farmers because they're getting less for the food as well. And the way they compensate is by farming more intensively. So we've been driving them partly through government policy and the CAP, European policy, but also through very, very competitive shopping. Effectively, we've been driving that decline in wildlife and the environment and soils and things by always going with the cheapest produce, and that has this whole system is based on that, and it's basically been a sort of race to the bottom. And if you go onto most farmland now, you'll see that it's a sort of barren monoculture which is devoid of wildlife, and so whether that's just wheat or oats as far as the eye can see with no hedges, or if it's down here in the West Country, it's more about pasture, and yet those pastures are one species mostly. It's ryegrass, which is intensively farmed for cattle to graze, and it's sprayed with pesticides, it's fertilized artificially. And so our countryside has become this kind of monoculture of different crops, whether that ends up being meat or ends up being cereals or vegetables. And that is what's driving the loss. It's just this intensification of agriculture. And that is the thing that we're asking people through Farm Wilder to reject, to try to avoid buying anything really, which is from intensive agriculture. And we want to, I mean, we set out thinking we'd do lots of different products across the range. We'd have mueslis and beer and cheese and wine from a particularly organic and sustainable vineyard in Sicily, maybe. But actually, we've just stayed with meat because meat is the most urgent issue. Grazing of our countryside has a massive impact on wildlife, both positive and negative, and yet it's in the press a lot as well. People have started to think that all meat is bad meat, which is just not true. Yeah. So we felt as Farm Wilder, we had a real job we can do in steering people towards good meat, which is great for the environment, great for wildlife, and steering them away from the bad meat, which is causing a lot of problems. So that's really that's where we've started, is with beef and lamb, and we may eventually do cheese and other products. But there's such a job to do there that I think just standing up for sustainable, wildlife friendly, low carbon or even carbon neutral beef and lamb is a really important job, and that's what we spend most of our time doing.
So I'll ask you in a bit, and we'll discuss definitely what a kind of typical Farm Wilder farm might look like, as opposed to perhaps some of the ones that you've described there, Tim. But it feels to me like it's quite unfair that a lot of the onus is being put on the consumer and the person buying the product in the shop. I mean, how much of this has to happen at a governmental level, and indeed consumers essentially being slightly tricked into buying, essentially environmentally damaging products?
I mean, the whole system is set up in a way that's very hard for us to do anything other than support intensive agriculture. And so, every time we go into a supermarket and buy just ordinary food from intensive agriculture, we're complicit in the destruction of wildlife in our countryside, and to increased pollution, increased greenhouse gases. And there's very little we can do about it because there isn't a choice. There's very little ways of buying food that aren't bad like that. I mean, ultimately, it would be great if the government could wave a magic wand and solve this, but it's difficult, especially in a global economy where there's always a danger of being undercut by cheap imports from abroad. I mean, there's been a lot of progress. The government is launching this ELM scheme, environmental land management, the idea being that farmers get paid rather than just for having land, but get paid for restoring their soil, planting hedges, having more wildlife, looking after waterways. That's all very positive, but that's just one way of addressing it. And I think it's not going to be successful if consumers, if shoppers aren't aware that actually we need to support farmers as well. And also, I do worry about that if it's just subsidies supporting farming, that's a very fickle thing, and it isn't enough for the government to change its priorities and go, actually, that money we were paying to farmers to be sustainable, we're taking away. So I think we need a more fundamental sort of revolution in how we see food now. I think we need to be aware of the consequences of the food we buy, and ideally to understand what impact, good or bad, that food is having.
I mean, and let's be clear as well. I mean, farmers are basically the most important part of our industrial or our economic system in so many ways, aren't they? Because they need to be looked after. They need to be given the opportunity, as you've described, to produce food in a way that isn't damaging. Because in the long term, that will be hugely beneficial for farmers as well. So I guess it's important not to alienate farmers. I mean, what's the feedback that you have in terms of the work that you do and the farmers who you work with, and do you see that message kind of spreading in many ways, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Farmers are critical to this, and the problem over the years is that farmers have just been doing what we wanted. They've been doing what the government wanted, what we wanted as consumers, wanting lower price food, and so they've intensified, and that's driven all these environmental problems. Now people are turning around and going, it's all your fault. You're responsible for all these burping cows that are causing you're responsible for all these neonicotinoids that are poisoning wildlife. It's all your fault. So farmers are a bit bemused by this. And you've got to realize that turning a farm around takes years. You get a farming system in progress, and you can't just sort of just change it overnight. So they've got a generation of farmers who's farmed in a certain way because we asked them to, and now we start to say, hang on, we're not sure about that anymore. So I think with Farm Wilder, there's two very important parts of what we do. One is making people aware, through our labeling, that you can buy meat which is good for the environment and good for wildlife, which we need that sort of meat. It's also important that we work with farmers to encourage them to farm in different ways. Partly that's about rewarding them financially. So our meat sells at a slightly higher price than the sort of damaging intensive meat, and we pass the money back to the farmers, typically 45 pence a kilo, as a reward for farming in a way that helps the environment and helps wildlife. So we're incentivizing, rewarding them for changing their ways, and that's important because most farm businesses, the finances are dire. They're heavily in debt, same the world over. And it's just very difficult for them. And so if you can't make it financially worth their while because they're struggling to stay afloat all the time, then forget it. So that's an important part of what we do. Also, I think just as important is the celebration of their farming that we do. So our labels that we have on our products and our flyers, like this, we celebrate the wildlife these farms have got on their farm. So this is fritillary butterfly beef, these marsh fritillaries, very rare species that some of our farms on Dartmoor have. And our labels tell the story of the whole ecology of this place, all the different plants and animals, the rare orchids, the rare plants, the dragonflies, the other butterflies, the birds that depend on this farming system. And I think just celebrating the way farmers work is really important. In a climate where they're often blamed, we're saying these guys are doing a great job. They're vital for the future of our wildlife. They can sequester loads more carbon in the soil. They can help us tackle climate change. They can make our rivers cleaner and reduce flooding. So I think the positivity of what we do is really, really important to farmers, and they've really responded to that. Even something as simple as having their name on a menu. We worked with a restaurant in Bristol, and they had some events and had a Sunday roast where we had wildlife-friendly beef from a named farmer in Dartmoor, and that makes a big difference to know they're being appreciated rather than criticized the whole time.
That's a really interesting point. And can I just say, what beautiful artwork on the card that you just held up, Tim? That's a really lovely way of illustrating how connected the whole system really is, and the farming system with the environment and with nature. And perhaps you could give us a little window, if you may, just into what a typical Farm Wilder farm would look like, or perhaps describe a kind of that typical farm. What would be different in the farms, the pasture-fed farms that you work with, as opposed to perhaps a more traditional intensive farming practice, and then by extension, what are the benefits to biodiversity and the natural systems?
Yeah, so we've got two groups of farmers. We've got our main group of farmers is in Devon, on and around Dartmoor, and most of these farms are upland hill farmers. It's quite tough rearing sheep and cattle up there. And they have some parts of the farm which are great habitat. They have a thing called a roast pasture, which is kind of a boggy, it literally means rush pasture. You get them in Wales, you get them in Northern Ireland and Scotland. They're sort of boggy areas in the bottoms of valleys, which are quite overgrown, and you get all sorts of lovely plants there, and you get wetter areas. You get these incredible yellow flag irises, and you get all sorts of beautiful wildflowers that specialize in boggy meadows. And one of those flowers is a thing called Devil's Bit scabious, has little purple pom-pom flowers in it. And that is the food plant of a very rare butterfly called the marsh fritillary butterfly. And so we've got a whole group of farms that have got this sort of habitat and got these really rare butterflies, the marsh fritillary butterflies. And they have to be grazed in a very particular way, those meadows. If you graze them too much, there's not enough food plant for the butterflies. Graze them too little, then willow scrub takes over and chokes it out. So you need just the right amount of grazing. So many of our farms have that habitat. Some of our other farms also have, slightly higher up the hillsides, have cuckoo habitat. Cuckoos, and this is another species we work with a lot, very endangered species, flying from Africa for a few months to lay their eggs in the nest of another bird. In the case of Dartmoor, they lay their eggs in nests of meadow pipits, little brown birds that fly around on sort of rough grazing. And cuckoos need, like the butterflies, they need a very specific habitat. They need places that are lots of meadow pipits. And for that, you need a mixture of grass, you need some scrub for the pipits to nest in, you need boggy areas where you get some of their more insects. So this sort of upland habitat, which we call upland heath, is great for cuckoos. And the cuckoos need a few trees as well, because that's what they sing from, you hear their calls. So the farmers have that habitat as well, and they manage it in a certain way so it's not too heavily grazed, where there's enough trees for the cuckoos and there's good habitat for the meadow pipits as well. So that's another important habitat that we celebrate on our labels. We have our cuckoo-friendly lamb and beef. So all these farms have these kind of scraggly areas that are good for wildlife. They also have more intensively farmed areas. And that's really interesting, because if you've got intensive parts of the farm, you might think that's really bad. So what we do is, because we encourage farmers to work in an entirely pasture-fed way, we encourage farmers on the bits of the farm that are more intensive to use a whole range of different plants. So rather than just having ryegrass fertilized by artificial fertilizers, we encourage them to plant what's called herbal lays, where they have a whole range of maybe 15, 20 species of plant, different flowers, herbs, legumes. And some of these plants bring nutrients deep from underground, some of them put nitrogen into the soil. And it's just a better system of farming that's much more sustainable, yet still quite productive. So some of our farms have that. And then we also have some farms which are called finishing farms. So for the very high up farms, it's very hard to fatten up animals there. So they rear them for most of their lives, and the animals get moved to a lower farm in the lowlands, where we have much more of these sort of herbal lays and a pasture-based system for fattening them up. So it's quite a complex thing, but at the heart of it, it's all about wildlife. It's about that specialized habitat for rare butterflies and cuckoos, and then a much more wildlife-friendly and climate-friendly system for the more sort of intensive areas, still sustainable, but more sort of intensively sustainable through these herbal lays and this pasture-fed technique.
That's fascinating to hear, Tim. Thanks for explaining that in such detail. It really is such a fascinating concept. And I mean, in terms of we talked early on about kind of consumption habits, and you talked about a need for a sort of fundamental revolution, indeed, in the way that we interact with our food and consider our food. I mean, in terms of the way that consumers are asked to purchase, but do we also need to kind of consider how much food we consume, how much meat we consume, and by extension the sort of the health effects of eating too much red meat and too much other forms of meat? How much of that side of the conversation are you interested in as well?
I think that's really critical, because I mean the system we work with, certainly for our farms in Dartmoor, is the pasture-fed method. Farms have to convert to being 100% pasture-fed. It's similar if you talk about organic as well, organic meat, organic other products. These approaches, which are more sustainable, fundamentally do use more land to produce the same amount of calories. With meat, that's particularly acute, because it's really very land-hungry producing meat. So the message we support is that we ask people to eat less meat, but better quality meat. Basically, there's an organisation called Eating Better that we're a part of, and I think the aim is to get people to eat 50% less meat and dairy. But to make sure that when they do have meat or dairy, that's actually from a much more sustainable source. So it's organic or it's pasture-fed. And there's a study that came out quite recently that if we do that, if we reduce the amount of grain we're feeding to animals, then we can feed the world sustainably using organic and pasture-fed techniques. And that is the fundamental problem with eating meat, is that most of the meat you buy, a large part of its diet is grain, and that can be grain from this country, it can be soya from South America, it can be parts of oil palm kernels from rainforests in Asia. So that's what drives the unsustainability of meat. So if you can switch from having meat which is largely, or to a large extent, fed on grains, to meat which has been reared on grass and herbs and legumes, then that's much more sustainable. But of course, we need to eat less of it so that we can feed the world sustainably.
And that's a really important connection to make, isn't it? The fact that, for those of us who want to see more woodland, more natural systems, or more diversity in our countryside, or indeed in our cities, wherever it may be, more biodiversity generally, so much of the land that we give over to monoculture, as you described, is really there to grow food for the livestock that we're then going to consume. Is that a too simple description?
Like 40% of all the grain that's grown in the world, all the grain crops, goes to feed animals. And that's cattle, it's pigs, it's poultry as well. I mean, poultry and pork are not very sustainable in many ways because they're fed so many grains. For me, the most sustainable meat in the UK is pasture-fed beef or lamb if it's grazed at low density in a wildlife-friendly way. And it's actually, we're looking into it at the moment, looking to if we can launch some poultry, some pork, but they are pretty dependent on grain crops. So I think, across the board, we need to be eating a bit less, but trying to select better quality, organic, pasture-fed, and just lessening our impact in that way.
That's a great and hugely important message, Tim, and one that we'd love to keep supporting and keep promoting, because we think it's extremely important what you guys are doing. I mean, just for our audience, for the Planted audience, Tim, could you just describe, let us know, where can we buy Filed Wilder products? If we want to buy pasture-fed meat, where can we go?
With Farm Wilder, we are just starting to supply Farm Drop. So in the sort of London area, that Farm Drop deliver. They don't deliver in Bristol at the moment. So Farm Drop will have it for sale. We're also working with a company called Ember Snacks, who make biltong and steak slices, and we've just started supplying them with minced beef for their steak slices, which are now on sale in Sainsbury's. And we're hoping to do more with Ember. So look out for Ember Snacks. You can get them from their website or from Sainsbury's. And that is wildlife friendly, regeneratively reared beef. And I think it's the most important thing, I think, is people break that connection thinking that all meat is bad. It's not. I mean, a lot of our wildlife relies on wildflower meadows. And so if you're buying this Ember steak slices or buying our meat from Farm Drop, you're directly supporting the grazing of meadows in a wildlife friendly way. So you're supporting orchids and rare butterflies. It's such an important message that meat can be, it's like electricity. You can have bad electricity that's produced from fossil fuels. You can have renewable electricity. It's the same with meat, even with beef. You can have regenerative, we call it. It's like renewable beef, effectively, which helps wildlife. So that's what it's all about. And if they can't get Farm Wilder stuff, then look out for pasture fed, the Pasture for Life certification. But it's pasture fed or organic. Organic is good as well. It's an alternative system, but it's so important that people reject intensively reared meat and go for these much more sustainable, wildlife friendly alternatives.
Tricky question, Tim, if I may, a couple just before we wrap this fascinating conversation up. But is there actually a moral responsibility here on people who can afford to eat, as you've described, what is more expensive products, to actually drive change by consuming in that way, consuming less but better quality meat? Is that part of this as well?
I think so. I mean, if people, it's in our hands basically. We have so much influence by what we choose to buy, what we choose to eat. By going to a restaurant and asking where their beef's come from and how it's reared. Every decision we make about our food can have an influence. And I, personally, I feel very passionate about it. I think it's critical, and I think it's interesting. Price is a tricky one. Ultimately, we do need to pay a little bit more for this sort of food, and I just urge anyone who can afford to spend a little bit more to do so. And ultimately, at the moment, the problem is if you buy intensive food from a supermarket, from wherever, which has been intensively reared, you're not paying the full cost of it, because the taxpayer is having to pay to clear up the pollution, to cope with climate change, to restore biodiversity. And ultimately, that's what the government has been subsidising. The government has been picking up the bill for that. What we'd like to see is the government, in some way, making funds available to effectively subsidise cheap, healthy food, which is sustainable. I think that is the way forward. I think in the meantime, we need to be trying to vote with our wallets and buy food which is better, and perhaps spend a little bit more on it. Not a lot more, but a little bit more on it. But in the longer term, I think we need to lobby the government to change the system so they're not subsidising intensive farming as they currently do, but they're subsidising sustainable, much healthier, more nutritious, healthy food.
Well, that's a great message to end on. I think that for the purposes of this interview, but certainly, if you can afford it, please do go out and look at high quality cuts of meat. This is about protecting biodiversity and protecting our environment for the long term. And also, let's remind us, eating high quality meat that's not been processed is of course a healthier option as well. So it's better for your family if you can do it. Please look out for it in restaurants. But Farm Wilder, obviously a fantastic organisation, and at Planted we're absolutely delighted to support Tim and the work that you guys are doing. So thank you very much indeed for being part of Planted Unearthed today, Tim.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that just leaves it for me to say, if you've enjoyed today's series of Planted Unearthed, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, details of which can be found on our website, www.planted-cities.co.uk. On there, you'll find more great editorial content from some of the leading writers and thinkers on design and sustainability, as well as exciting news about our flagship Planted event in London, which I'm delighted to say will, COVID restrictions notwithstanding, take place at King's Cross from September the 23rd to the 26th this year. Watch out too for news of our exciting Planted Members Scheme, which will be launching in time for the summer. More details to follow soon. So that just leaves it to me to say thanks again to Tim from Farm Wilder. Thank you to you for watching. My name's Sam Peters, and this has been Planted Unearthed.